Good morning, Robert Scribbler here. I'm going to explore a subject that is one of some controversy in the media today. And what we're going to look at first is the fact that numerous fossil fuel proponents are making the false claim across the world, at least across the Western world, that energy sources such as wind and solar pose a serious threat to grid stability and risk of blackouts. And in all honesty, this is exaggerating challenges posed to grid stability by renewables. If you look at any of the scientific studies, you'll find that clean energy does not pose a risk to grid stability. In fact, a decentralized grid is more stable as long as it is managed properly. This claim that wind and renewable energy sources, clean energy sources like wind and solar pose a threat to grid stability has been promoted by such persons as Rick Perry, Donald Trump, and a number of climate change deniers. But what we find if we look at the facts, if we look at studies, is that grids are capable of handling a very high percentage of renewable energy without threatening grid stability. This Department of Energy study was written back in 2017, and what it found was that there were numerous studies citing overwhelming evidence from real-world experience as well as multiple scientific studies by the Department of Energy's own national labs and regional grid operators confirming that the United States can safely and reliably operate the electric grid with high levels of renewables. These studies project renewables will be able to provide 80% of the nation's electricity mix by 2050 while maintaining reliability. Wind and solar already provide many essential reliability services as well or better than inflexible coal and nuclear plants. I'm going to highlight this and say it again. Wind and solar already provide many essential reliability services as well or better than inflexible coal and nuclear plants. So the truth of the matter is that renewable energy is more nimble, especially when integrated into a distributed grid, and that includes microgrids, that includes solar and storage from various sources such as pumped hydro and batteries. And what we're finding now is that battery storage is better at grid stabilization than any fossil fuel or traditional source. So if anyone's telling you that wind and solar are a threat to grid stability, what they're saying is basically bullshit, and you should call them out on it. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about a real threat, and this is one posed by climate change. So, we talk a lot about the scenarios that will prevent the world from hitting what is called the 2 degrees Celsius threshold. And many scientists have identified this threshold as kind of a line in the sand for climate change. What we should be clear on is that the more the Earth warms, the worse the situation gets. So 2 degrees Celsius is kind of an arbitrary line. We are at about 1 degree Celsius now, maybe 1.2 degrees Celsius, and we're already seeing impacts. We're already seeing serious negative consequences as a result of that warming, which many would have considered mild. The 1.5 degree threshold would see worse impacts. 2 degrees Celsius would probably see some very serious impacts. But what we're talking about here when it comes to climate change is avoiding terrible impacts. And terrible impacts are what we would call a business as usual fossil fuel burning scenario, meaning that in the worst case scenario, in the business as usual scenario, fossil fuels continue to be burned at high rates, and those rates of burning continue to rise. And so this kind of scenario is absolutely catastrophic. No one wants to live in a world where we continue to burn fossil fuels. That world is a world filled with devastation, mass extinction, and the loss of many things that we hold dear. So this is a choice between two possible climate change scenarios, but it's also a choice between burning fossil fuels and transitioning to renewable energy. One of these future pathways is livable and survivable, and one of these future pathways is probably not. So when people talk to you about so-called crises caused by renewable energy that are actually not crises, if you actually look at the facts, think about these two scenarios. Think about what kind of future you want to live in, or you want your children to live in. A future in which climate change is at least potentially rather manageable, but still possibly relatively difficult, or in which climate change is a complete nightmare scenario. These are the two futures that we're fighting for now. And so when you see headlines like this, think about this. And think about actual scientific studies that show that renewable energy is both less expensive, less harmful, more reliable, and easier to manage than even what is considered traditional energy sources.